You are listening to Something Rather Than Nothing. Creator and host Ken Vellante. Editor and producer Peter Bauer.
It's interesting from my perspective that like things I've written about for years are suddenly being discovered by like everybody. So that's kind of like with Hart Island and things. It just every time I write about Hart Island, I'm like, I'll never have to write that story again. It's just nope, people still don't know it exists. It's fascinating. So, but I don't know how much you want to get into like COVID-19 things.
Well, and I think that's and maybe just before we launch in, maybe we should just take a minute on that. Like, so I was, I was quite simply drawn to your topics, and like I kind of joked, I saw like the Sedlets, ossuary, and things like that, where it's like just kind of fascinating, but also like how much to talk about like death, right? Like, because death is like in front of us, right? Death and disease, right? Like more in front of us right now. And I think one of the things that, I mean, you like, if you, what I could see about the symbols in the cemetery and all the things you're talking about, there's like these larger narratives, right? Where people have dealt with death in different ways and dealt with mortality. And I just see you in investigating that, researching that, writing about that, is just like looking at that directly, right? Like, I'm going to look at it directly. And I mean, what's been your experience in talking about that? I mean, is it something where it's like you kind of feel like, I don't know if I should keep going on and chat about this, or just like we should just kind of like forge into it, right? Don't you think?
Yeah. You mean like forge into the topic of death?
Yeah. Well, I mean, just like, just with, like, there's no reason to sugarcoat the depiction of disease, Spanish flu, like that article, right? Like, and kind of like get right into it. I mean, we don't have to exist in there for the whole like interview, but I guess what I'm telling you too is like, let's get into it. Let's chat about it. You know what I mean? And not
and I think it's definitely a conversation I've been having with, I'm pretty connected with other people who write and think about death. And so for us, I think it's like, of course, you're always thinking about what happens when someone dies, who's caring for their body, how are we mourning them? And it has like a heightened visibility now. And I think that that's really interesting. And like how I was talking with Jessica Bomert, who's president of the Woodlands Cemetery in Philadelphia, which is like a fascinating place. They've really remade themselves as like a community gathering place. They let people garden graves. And she was how like it's not just the COVID deaths that are visible, it's like all death is visible right now, because it's like even if your grandfather dies at the age of 93 not from COVID, like you can't have a funeral for him, or you can't like gather together like you would. So there's kind of like this new focus on it, I think, in a way that there hasn't been before. But I guess like me personally, because I write about death and culture a lot and also lead cemetery tours, and I'm just personally interested, it's like brought a new attention to me that things I've written about a lot or thought about a lot are still needing attention. Because sometimes I think like, well, I've written about this 100 times, I don't need to write about it again. But it's a good reminder that even though death is hardly like a unique experience, it's still kind of invisible.
And there's also like a particular treatment that I found within, the U.S. as far as, I mean, there's a cultural kind of context of how death is viewed. And once there's a lot of discussion about like the industry, right? I mean, I've read like Caitlin Doughty's stuff, and which is, really, really fascinating stuff. And part of the thing too, I was thinking of when it comes to cemeteries and some things I read in the past was like Lauren Rhodes, morbid curiosity cures the blues. And it's like one of those statements that for me is always just like resonant. I'm like, that's such a true statement. Like, there's some sort of like comfort in like feeling like you can look at these things that are very much part of our experience rather than like sublimating them, underneath. Right. Mm-hmm. So, all right. So Allison, what were you, so tell me what you were like as a young child.
I mean, I guess I honestly didn't get into cemeteries until I moved to New York at the age of 24. So that kind of like came later. Just, I guess I do it chronologically, but like it just happened. I moved a block away from Greenwood Cemetery and was just fascinated with that there was this huge Victorian burial ground that kind of was stuck in time while the rest of New York has propelled forward. So I got into cemeteries more because I was always interested, I think, in history and storytelling. So I grew up in a small town in Oklahoma, and yeah, I guess as a kid, I like the usual person who grows up into a literary nerd. I like to read. Library was great. I don't feel like I had like an exceptionally unusual childhood, but I think also growing up in Oklahoma, it's not until I moved away from it that I realized it was kind of different from the rest of the country. It's just like, it's one of the last states to become part of the United States. It's got this like boom town kind of feel to it still. And the visual culture is also very different. Like, it didn't occur to me growing up that, not everyone knows who like the Kiowa Five are, or like indigenous art is kind of absent in the rest of the country. So yeah, and I was in Oklahoma through college, and then I moved to France for a little while, and then I moved to New York. So that's kind of my like trajectory in time.
Yeah, and so everybody listen to Something Rather Than Nothing. We're talking with Allison C. Meier, and she's a writer, researcher, published in a lot of publications, and one of the things I was wondering, Allison, is you seem to go into a lot of different research areas or topics in your writing. When we're talking about art, what forms of art attract you?
Sure. I tend to think about art, and I think I describe it as visual culture a lot of the time because I like to look at visual expression in a very wide way because I think that's more accessible for more people. So like I'm more than happy that I get a chance to write about like the Laszlo Moholy-Nagy show at the Guggenheim or something. But then I also have spent a lot of time like looking at manhole covers and thinking about them as fine art, or maybe not fine art, but like at least a graphic art. And yeah, like I appreciate art that kind of engages in the world in ways that people can access. Like I recently wrote about this project that oh gosh, I shouldn't say people's names if I'm not going to get them right. Ellie Laurel and Anne Brucoco, who were like cutting up sections of lawns to show the dormant seed banks below them to kind of show like why American lawn culture is bad for the environment because like it's covering up all these like native plants and stuff. And I like that because it's sculpture in a way. And as they told me, like you wouldn't let someone just come in and tear up your yard, but if you frame it as art, you're kind of given permission to do things that you wouldn't otherwise. So I like art that kind of does that and brings in those important conversations in ways. Another one like I did recently was at the Field Museum. This artist, Chris Papin, did these really interesting graphics over the display cases and their Native American hall, because those display cases like hadn't been updated since, decades, and the label text is very problematic. The way that the objects are presented in a natural history museum is, problematic. And rather than, I think the museum does plan at some point to do a big overhaul, but he was able to do this intervention to layer over a more honest indigenous history while still recognizing that that was part of the museum. So I'm always excited when artists are bringing those kind of questions into everyday spaces where you wouldn't see them, but then also thinking about what can you do as an artist that you couldn't do in another role.
Yeah, I read that article about the lawns too, and you can geek out on that, because I thought there was some absolutely fascinating concepts, right? I mean, the environmental impact was obviously, or at least for me, was first and foremost in the consideration. But I even think the concepts that you had in there of the kind of these kind of submerged wildness that's underneath the lawn, and these seeds in kind of that time capsule of who knows what's going to come up where. I had no concept that potential was right there. So I thought it was, I thought it was truly wild. And like you said, in putting in the concept of art, right? Because I mean, take a look at HOAs, the worst organizations, well, I'm not going to go on the HOA rant, but a completely useless appendage, in my opinion, most of the time. And kind of counterintuitive rules around lawns and perfection and this picturesque type of thing. So I thought that article and what you were exploring was very subversive and freeing. So
and
I enjoyed that.
I got Ellie Irons, not Ellie Laurel. Sometimes I don't do well remembering names off the top of my head. She's fantastic. Not the only time I've written about her art. Didn't want to get her name wrong.
So yeah, and so I really appreciated reading about that. And of course, we can get into a little bit too about which cemetery tours, but just about as far as the green space that's there and the lawns and all that, I see it as intertwined. So, Allison, I mean, you're really smart. You research a lot of things. You encounter a lot of art. What is art?
Yeah, I mean, that is probably not something I can answer or anyone can. But for me, what I approach art as something that's been done in a deliberate way, kind of as a form of visual expression. But I think art can be just about anything, which is an annoying way to look at things sometimes. But for where I come from, it's ways of manipulating the world, I guess, to ask questions. It doesn't have to always be in galleries and museums or even public art installations. And sometimes maybe the person doing it didn't even really consider it art. I think about W.E.B. Du Bois' data visualizations, or I'm interested in 19th century spiritualists who kind of used drawing to record what they were experiencing with the spirit world. And maybe they weren't necessarily thinking, I am creating art, but I think that what it is art. So yeah, that's a hard question to answer. And I have a BA in journalism too. And so I certainly am not the person that is going to answer that question once and for all. But I think it's a good thing to continue to ask, because if we only think art is what's hanging on the museum walls, then I think that really limits our a lot of richness in the world.
Yeah, and I appreciate your speculations on it, because a lot of time, I find that's what it is, speculations on the topic. And even with theorists, kind of try to point where, like is with the novel, is there a perfectly written novel, right? Is there one without extraneous words, and it has to do with a lot of the context and definition. And yeah, I appreciate your comments on that. Allison, I had conveyed to you, I had read your article, Spanish flu and the depiction of disease. It was written last fall, and I'm very glad I encountered it because I was able to, read about a topic that has been interesting me more recently. But also, I'm a big fan of Egon Schiele, the painter, his art. And, as far as that article, and how it pulled me in and drew me in, of course, again, was the topic of, art in a pandemic. But also this piece I had never seen, that painting, unfinished painting by Egon Schiele of him, his wife, and his wife being pregnant, and the painting itself depicting the child, which was never born because both Egon Schiele and his wife were taken by the Spanish flu. It's a truly haunting painting. Can you, you wrote that article in the fall prior to our current and historical pandemic that we're experiencing. Can you just talk a little bit about how that article came about and kind of connect it to the general question of what role art has in a pandemic?
Yeah, so I wrote that, of course, not knowing that only months from then I would be under lockdown during a pandemic. So I was not thinking about this applying necessarily to our lives now, but it's interesting. I published that article in October, how it's kind of taken on a new resonance, even for me having written it. So I was really thinking about, we had just reached the centennial of the 1918 to 1919 flu epidemic, which is often called the Spanish flu, but not because it had anything to do with Spain. They just were the only ones really reporting on it honestly, which is a whole other thing you could go into. But for the art aspect, I was thinking about this happens in 1918. This is a real big time of upheaval in the art world with modernism. It's coming right after the Armory show. There's artists like Egon Schiele doing really interesting depictions of the body. And I just wondered, I've never seen a museum retrospective about the Spanish flu. I think the closest we got last year was the Mutter Museum did an exhibition on the 1918 flu in Philadelphia, which got hit pretty hard. But it wasn't really about art, although they did team up with this performance group called Blast Theory to do this parade that commemorated the people that died. And so I just wondered about this absence of art, and that's always interesting to me, when there seems to be something missing. So I started on this little investigation through history to see what art existed, and with the Schiele painting, he didn't paint that as a memorial to the family he never ended up having, but it kind of ended up being that, he started it and then didn't finish it when he and his pregnant wife died in that epidemic or pandemic. And when I was researching the article, I think I was surprised at how little art there was, but then when I started to think about it, the art that does exist that was actually grappling with it, Edvard Munch had painted some self-portraits of himself before and after he was going through the flu, and you just see how they sapped your energy. And if you've ever been really sick, and you get better, the last thing you want to do is kind of dwell on what just happened to you. You want to move on. And especially with that epidemic coming right after World War I, there was even more of an urgency to get back to normal. And I think now I'm thinking about it more because we keep having all these talks like, when are we going to get back to normal? And I worry, you would think that such things would never be forgotten, but I would bet the 1918 flu was pretty obscure to people until this year, even though it killed more people than World War One. It's just we tend to have this forgetfulness with disease, and I think it's because, like, if you died in World War One, like, you died a hero. There's monuments to you, but you probably have flags on your grave every year. But if you died of the flu, you just died of the flu. And so now we're experiencing this loss again. And I wonder if it's going to have artists kind of reflecting on this. Like, there's certainly a lot of art happening right now. Like, people are showing on Instagram, people are doing collaborative projects, but they tend to be very much these kind of like, we're all together, let's get through this. They're not really dealing with the really haunting, terrible aspects of either getting the flu and thinking you're going to die, or losing someone and not being able to mourn them. So because I wrote that article for the Wellcome collection, which is based in London, they have a really smart focus on medicine, kind of with a cultural focus. So that is how that article came about. But it's interesting, they're not actually the first place I tried to pitch something similar to. I was pitching things about 1918 flu like all last year before, and people were like, oh, it's not that timely. Like, what does this have to do with now? And now it's like exceptionally timely. So it's interesting how like we've had this collective memory of something that had really faded out of our public consciousness.
Yeah, and I think that you bring up that point. I mean, it just struck me when you're saying it as far as the amount of deaths exceeding World War One, which is, I think if people do know about World War One and done a little bit of research, maybe read literature and the history around it, I mean, it's regarded as an absolute horrific horror on the planet Earth, of an absolute bloodbath, right? And but then, as you mentioned, the flu, contemporaneous with that occurring, is taking out even more people, right? And the difference between how those deaths are remembered. Do you find it a little bit eerie now that like you had written that, and like, now everybody's like looking at this and it's like, oh, the Spanish flu, and getting into the history of that? Do you find it a little bit strange to observe from your vantage point, having already gone into that?
Oh, yeah. Well, and I also find it strange. So this isn't the only article I wrote about the 1918 flu. I wrote some like just purely history focused ones too. And I was writing about, everyone wearing masks and everything being shut down and the church bells stopped ringing. And when I was writing that stuff, I was like, wow, I can't imagine what that would be like. And now, so quickly later, I live in New York, everyone's wearing a mask, everything's pretty shut down. And there is like an eerie quiet to a lot of parts of the city. And so it's interesting to have read about that history. Or like even this week, I was writing a story that hasn't gone up about plague columns, which were put up in the 18th and 17th century to kind of commemorate that you had made it through a plague. There's a really famous one in Vienna. And I was reading about the 17th century plague that Vienna column commemorates. And there's this passage someone wrote about how it was awful, all the bodies, all the death, but also how awful it was to see your friends on the street and not being able to say hi to them. And I was like, it's like now. Like, it's kind of wild. But then I also, on the flip side of that, it's of course like these are always awful times, but it does kind of reassure me reading through these things that are so similar that like we have gone through this in the past. And I think that's the understanding that history gives me. Like, people have experienced epidemics and pandemics before, and we're still here. Like, society is still here. It's different every time it goes through that. People die and there are tragedies, but I do find it kind of reassuring that it's like people have survived through terrible times that seemed like they will never end. And so we will get through this one too.
Yeah, I appreciate you pulling out that point, and about the role of history, and and I appreciate all your efforts in the research, and I think a lot of what you're have written about, while a personal interest to me, has some importance of like pulling out history and kind of like reclaiming some ideas that otherwise might be lost. I One of the things I wanted to chat with you about is I personally took notice of so I like spooky stuff, right? Like I like books like Wisconsin Death Trip, and like the role of photography, black and white old time photography around the occult, even shows that are super popular now, right? On television of trying to capture paranormal and things like that. So I have a deep interest in that, in the kind of the veil between like life and death. And you had written some about the role of photography and spirit photography, and like the role it played historically, like one sense of like, is there any documentation of like the spirit world versus the manipulations that go into basically early filters and that were created to create these images in spirit photography. Can you talk a little bit about that article and a little bit about the background of that phenomena?
Yeah, and I think I'm not 100% sure which article you're referring to, but I've written about it a few times, I think in different contexts, and given talks about it too. So like spirit photography, I guess for people who might not know, emerged in the 19th century alongside spiritualism, which was in its simplest form people trying to speak to the dead, whether that was through seances or spirit drawing. And spirit photography played on that. Photography was pretty new, and there was already a lot of experimentation with basically any type of new technology and spiritualism. Like some people even proposed, rather than laying the transatlantic cable, you could use spirits to talk between the US and the UK. So people were, and if you look at like spirit rapping, it's not that dissimilar from Morse code. So there was all these interesting intersections between spiritualism and technology. And I am always really interested in 19th century photography because, like, it was the first time in human history you could really rapidly capture moments, but people were still kind of figuring out what that meant. So it started out like kind of being people would stage things like paintings, and it got into portraiture and documentation. And with the spirit photos, basically you go into a studio, you get a photo, and supposedly on that photo is a spirit. And they take kind of like different forms, like some of them are very ethereal, just blasts of light. Some of them are actual faces. And when I started researching it, I think I was coming, like, I love weird Victorian stuff, like, and the weirder, the better.
Sure.
And there's a lot of funny photographs of, like, people holding their own or, like, pretending they're in skiing or something. And so I came into it, I was like, look at this weird thing. Like, this is so strange. How would anyone believe this? But I think as I read about it more and more, I got a real empathy with people who were doing it because, like, if you lost someone in the 19th century, like you maybe didn't even have a photograph of them. And so these things were kind of just to remember that someone had been there at all, however imperfectly. So, like, of course, that spirit might look nothing like your loved one, but the need to believe in it was so strong that I think we, from that perspective, can find a lot of empathy in them. And I even got into enough that there's this really, I don't know if you know about it, there's this place in New York called the Penumbra Foundation, and they do like historic photography practices. So they actually have a tintype studio, and the woman who manages it, Jolene Lupo, created a spirit photograph for me. So I got to see the whole process of what it would be like to go into a tintype studio, get the photograph, and then how it was like exposed on the plate. And it was really it's just a fascinating history of photography. And I love that, like, there's still this one place carrying on tintype spirit photos. And I also did the closest thing I think you can get to like an honest spirit photograph, which is an aura photograph. And I went into Magic Jewelry in Chinatown in New York, and you can get this Polaroid taken of you of like your aura supposedly around you, and they do this reading. And it was just kind of like a nice experience. Like, the reading of it was like, oh, you're really tired. You've been running around a lot, which I think could apply to anyone living in New York. But there is just something oddly nice about kind of like creating these moments of like self-reflection through photography. So through that whole process of researching and then actually trying to get firsthand experiences with what a spirit photo would have been like really changed my understanding of it going in, and I love any time I can do that with a story.
Yeah, I saw that the image of the spirit photography. I think you might have posted that image. It's a beautiful rendition. I mean, it's an incredible photograph. Did just within that process is a process that takes a long time.
Yeah, I mean, I think the longest. It takes a lot longer on the photographer's part. So like creating the plate, exposing the plate, protecting the plate. You as the subject just kind of go in there and get a bright light flashed in your face, and then you're on your way. I think people think it definitely takes longer than for me to take a selfie on my iPhone. Like I think it's like 15 seconds or something. You have to hold your pose, but it's not anything. It doesn't take as long as like you might think based on all these stories about people like not being able to smile because they were staring for so long.
That's what I was wondering too. I know some of those photographs. I know with their some of the technologies, older technologies of needing to capture like every bit of light. I hear these stories of like having to stand in like stifling clothes for a long time.
Oh yeah, and I'm sure if I had been wearing like a 50-pound Victorian dress or something, it would have been a lot more unpleasant.
An incredible exercise in patience.
Yeah.
One of the questions I wanted to ask you that I ask all the creators I have on the podcast is did you ever ask yourself why it is you create? I mean, writing's a difficult endeavor, writing and researching and trying to get history right or get the story right. It takes an incredible amount of effort. Have you ever, kind of wondered for yourself in your creative process why you do it?
Yeah, I mean, I think every writer wonders that every time they sit down to write a new, and it's not easy. It's not. I think it was like David Rakoff had something about like writing. It's like you're coming back to the beginning every time, and so definitely it's not an easy thing to do to create something. Whatever you're doing. I never had anything else I wanted to do rather than to be a writer. Like, I guess going back to your first question about childhood, I think my mom even found something where I had written at 9 years old that I needed to have good handwriting, so I was going to be a writer. So I always that's what I wanted to do. But how I got into like history stuff, I think it's just like I see that there's a lot of stories there that aren't being told, and I definitely report tons on the current world, interviewing living artists, but I also think it's really important that there's visibility to the past because so much of what we have now, everything we have now is built on that. but yeah, it's for process of writing, it is like kind of still a mystery. Every time I sit down to write a story, I'm like, I hope this works because you're kind of just basing it on like this just thing you don't quite understand in yourself that I think a lot of artists and creators probably feel where you're I guess going back to spiritualism, maybe another reason why I identify with this. I feel like with art type of writing, you are channeling something in a way that doesn't always make sense, or at least that's how I feel for me. Maybe other people are like really just doing it in a way that I haven't quite figured out.
Yeah, there's always that question. I think in what you said, you're always kind of like doing it again, right? And it's kind of part of the theme of like, all right, I finished that and that's published, and then there's this whole realm, and I know my process, but like, all right, is this going to come out? Like, how's this going to develop, right? Like, what's it going to be?
Yeah, totally.
Another thing I wanted to ask you about is you do cemetery tours, and I right down the road from me, I did a little research when I moved into town. I'm in Albany, Oregon, just out of the capital of Oregon, Salem, and there's a Jewish cemetery, Waverly Jewish Cemetery, right nearby me, and I didn't know, but it's like one of the ways I try to learn is like, what's around, what are the parks that are around, what's the nature that's around, and the cemetery being there is the largest Jewish cemetery, I think, between Portland or Seattle and San Francisco.
Mm-hmm.
And it's small, and I just, walk around it, and there's like a little placard, and it's definitely a unique history, very much tied to this area. I know on your writing and the basis from what I've seen in your tours of the cemeteries, in particular out there in New York City, is kind of your explanation and explication of what symbols are there, the narratives or the stories or the practices, the cultural practices around, cemeteries and mourning and death. Can you just chat about like some of the kind of like the history that you find in the tours that you yourself conduct as a tour leader?
Yeah, and I think every cemetery is unique depending on its time and place. Do you know when like the Jewish cemetery near you got opened?
Yeah, so it certainly goes back, and then you look at the dates. It's like late 19th century, and kind of like first half 20th century. There's not a lot of newer stone, but it was like a particular area to be interred, regionally, and all that stuff's always connected to potential like anti-Semitism or whether there's Jewish culture in particular areas. But yeah, it's an old one. I think some of them go back to mid 19th century there.
And do you like, have you seen like a 21st century Jewish cemetery?
I have not. The other one I had been to was the Jewish cemetery in Prague, which is
definitely not 21st century.
It's not 21st century. It's initially incomprehensible, but wonderfully fascinating. But no, not a newer one. No.
Yeah, I'm curious because one of the cemeteries I've spent some time in New York is Bayside Cemetery in Ozone Park in Queens. And it's also from that time period. It sounds like the one near you is. And it's really interesting because New York has a huge Jewish population. So there's Jewish cemeteries going back to like the 1700s. And the modern ones, they're all pretty densely packed. Uniform graves and have a lot of like Judaic symbolism, but then the ones from the 19th century, the early 1900s, don't. They look just like Victorian cemeteries, and it's kind of interesting that these burial traditions have changed over time, like visual expression, that what people were choosing to remember themselves with. I think you can read a lot into like how they saw themselves within society. And I'm certainly not the one to speak on Jewish history, so I won't go too deep into this. But like, I think maybe the one near you, it's always interesting to me to see like, well, they had urns on their monuments or like these really big mausoleums or something that you wouldn't think to see in a Jewish cemetery. It's like, well, maybe that's how they were identifying, wasn't necessarily by their religion, but by their place in society, which has changed over time. But anyway, I always want to hear more about people's local cemeteries, but I guess
well,
one
of the things that I find, and this is very, very particular. I mean, I think the first time that I recall the practice it might exist in other cultures, but seen within the Jewish cemeteries is placing a rock on the headstone, which is a remembrance. But it's also like a tiny ritual which I participated in seeing. Savannah, I was in, the other Jewish cemetery and all the Gothic, fascinating Southern Gothic, cemeteries down in the haunted city of Savannah, Georgia. But the practice of putting, the stones on the top of the gravestone, which for me, even though there's this anonymity to the individuals that I'm there, not connected to that history, there's some sort of grounding aspect of that ritual that I just adore. And it's a way to participate or interact in a way that I haven't known in other cultural aspects of, and somehow seeing, piles of stones on top of the stone where others have taken the moment to remember or recognize that individual is just really fascinating practice.
Yeah, to really just show like I was here and remembered you. It's a powerful symbol. And I wish I've never had the chance to go to Savannah, but it looks like incredible cemeteries there.
Well, incredible, but also, I mean, there's always these, I've been down in New Orleans and Savannah, just like the context of like, I don't know, there's something that's kind of Southern haunted Gothic, but also like, the ghost stories, right? And it's pretty deep. And some of it, obviously tilts to a commercialized, like hokey aspect of which I will completely participate in as well. But also some of the, the older history. And I think part of it is, I'm a Yankee. I'm from up in, Rhode Island. I grew up outside of Providence. So, what different regions of this country mean for me, there's a particular meaning of going south, when you're from the north and different ways of interacting. But so your tour, the tours that you do in New York City, I mean, these popular tours, I mean, they book way up in advance, or I mean, I know times are obviously quite different, but like
yeah, not so popular now.
Yeah, like what what happens? Is it an hour or two, or like how do you conduct it?
Yeah, it really depends. I am always fascinated because I think a cemetery tour is always a good idea. What people get excited about, what they don't. So like I've done tours that have sold out immediately on, usually they're about symbolism, magic, spiritualism, and women's history. People are all in on that. The tours I curiously have trouble getting people on are like the nature themed tours, which I wonder if it's like, it's one thing to go to a cemetery, it's another thing to go to a nature walk in a cemetery that maybe attracts a different group. But I will say the people that show up for the nature walks are like the most excited to be there because they are excited. They are always like usually local New York people who like are obsessed with urban nature and they know more about the trees there than me. It's always great. But yeah, so I mainly do the tours at Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn, but I've also done them like Woodland Cemetery in the Bronx, Hartsdale Pet Cemetery, which is just north of here. And then I've also done like a few walking tours in Manhattan on Death in Colonial New York and this used to be a cemetery, which was where cemeteries used to be. That one was also unpopular, sadly, but I thought I did a tour I myself would want to go on. You just never
Yes.
quite know what people are going to be into, or it just depends, like the time of year too. Like you schedule as many cemetery tours as you want in October, they will sell out. In February, it's a little thinner. So
It's like writing the book that you want to read. I mean, you want to you're creating the tour that you want to take, but sometimes not everybody wants to take the same tour.
Yeah, and I haven't written any books, but my understanding is you can do the same thing, like write the book you want or write the book that's going to be good for the market. And there's the same thing with cemetery tours. But luckily, I don't do them for the money. I mean, I do get paid to have full disclosure, but it's not my main job. So I'm really doing it more just because, like, I think as a writer, I spend a lot of time at my computer writing things for the internet or publishing. And it's nice to actually get out and share stories with humans face to face, although of course not now in pandemic days. But yeah, that's what's been my interest in doing them. And I think I've been doing it since 2011. So a little while. And yeah, I always, like, I have yet to run out of things to create new tours about.
And thank you for sharing that. I mean, I find, just for myself, like I've thought about like, just always ever since I was a little kid, just kind of like whether it's interest in ghosts or like, I listen to a lot of doom and death metal. Like it's like a component of my personality that I think I always have to navigate. And I think folks who have this interest have to. One of the ways I described it is like even kind of like looking and trying to learn from human like atrocities or people under extreme duress. For me, it's always been potentially very inspiring, right? To see how human beings react or how we try to like create meaning within this context. So for myself, I always tapped into kind of like very vibrant, like energy parts of like rather than shying away, I've just kind of seen human beings be very interested, that context that they're placed in to be very interesting in trying. And it's dark. It feels dark, but I don't know. I think it's always like we're always looking for permission of like just trying to figure out how to deal with mortality. And, I think part of the thing is as a philosopher and with the philosophy podcast, I mean, Plato said is just, philosophy is just contemplation of death. That's all it is, right? All the big questions, right? Like, why are we doing any of this? There's a lot of questions you don't have to ask if you're immortal, right? So,
that's an interesting way to look at it. Do you mean in like creating space for it? Like in music's kind of, I'm not involved with doom metal or anything, but there's a lot of ways you can come at it because it is a universal thing.
So the title of the podcast, the big question that I have is, why is there something rather than nothing? I was going to ask you your thoughts on that.
Like something rather than nothing.
Yeah.
Another big question put up there with like what art is. I think like, for me, like I think that drawn to cemeteries is like I find that, and I know this is not everybody, but I do find that recognizing the brevity of life and that our time here is brief really does give my life importance, and it gives that kind of like something, whereas I think without that it could feel like nothing. So I think like when I walk through Greenwood or cemeteries elsewhere and see all these lives that have come before me, it does really put a sense of importance on the time that I have, and also maybe a little bit not that too, because you recognize like you could be one of a million, and that's okay. So I find those kind of sides of it to be reassuring. And yeah, with death, I think we all experience it. We all have dead, we all confront it at some point in our lives. And so it's very present with us, but I think like you can either recognize it and have a positive relationship with death, or you can be afraid of it. And for me, having spent a lot of time in cemeteries, gotten to know funeral directors, people in the death industry, I think it's made me feel less afraid of death and more comfortable with that side of nothing too, because as someone that doesn't really believe in an afterlife, I also am okay with that, and that's been nice to kind of come out through cemeteries.
Yeah, and thank you for that answer. It's a yeah, it's quite the way to look at it. So Allison, like I said, I've read a lot of your articles. Like I told you, I'm personally a big fan. I find them to be they're exciting in the sense of what they explore, and a lot of it feels really new. And I definitely suggest, to all the listeners to check out more of your writing. But could you just mention like ways to access your works or where to look? I was going to read the bylines. You get a lot of bylines. It's a lot of big. It's very impressive.
Well,
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, for most people who are full-time writers, you end up writing a lot because it's your job. But yeah, I guess I have most of my work at AllisonCMeier.com, and then I also have a Twitter account under my same name. I guess in terms of things I've written recently, I wrote for National Geographic about Hart Island because there's a lot of misunderstanding about it right now in terms of COVID-19. Like was a lot of sensationalizing about New York digging mass graves, but these have existed since the 19th century. And I've also been writing about pandemic history for JSTOR Daily recently, trying to like put things in context. But yeah, those are, and then I'm working on a story for Wellcome Collection right now about the rural cemeteries right now being these places of urban retreat, much in the same way they were when they were founded in the 19th century. So those are like I guess there's a lot of death right now. So sadly, I have never been busier with writing, for better or worse. Just because it's like interesting that all these things I've written about for years are suddenly very central on people's minds.
Yeah, and thanks for laying that out there too. And it's a very nice website, and there's a lot of ability to connect to your writings. And but I just Allison, it's been a pleasure to talk to you, and I just really wanted to thank you for spending time on the podcast. Like I said, both from like personally as far as my interest and my being really fascinated with your writing, and your very considered answers. I mentioned a lot of times with this podcast, like there's a selfish component where I'm just really just like listening here, talking, and just learning. So it's very rewarding for me and for the listeners. But I just wanted to I just wanted to really thank you for taking the time in joining Something Rather Than Nothing.
Yeah, and thanks for asking. I think like maybe like a lot of creators, I don't really pause to think why I do things. So this has been interesting for me too.
Thanks again, Allison. And again, really appreciate your time, and you take care.
Yeah, you too.
Bye now.
Bye.
You are listening to Something Rather Than Nothing.